The storm did not arrive loudly. It crept in low and patient, pressing its weight into the horizon until the sky itself seemed to bow. By the time he realized how far he was from shelter, the ice had already decided what it wanted from him. He had not come north looking for redemption, but the Arctic has a way of stripping intention down to bone. The man moved slowly across the frozen plain, every step measured, breath shallow to conserve heat, the wind peeling layers of warmth from his body, as if it knew exactly where to hurt him most. His name was Elias, though at that moment it felt like a detail that no longer mattered. What mattered was the way the snow crusted instantly on his lashes, how the cold invaded his lungs with each inhale, and how the vast white silence made even his thoughts feel too loud. Somewhere behind him lay a life he had failed to protect. Somewhere ahead, only ice and the narrowing margin between survival and surrender. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. The Arctic remembers those who listen, and stories like this are carried farther when more voices walk with them. He noticed her not by sight at first, but by disruption. The wind shifted unnaturally, the snow swirling as if parted by a living presence, and then the outline emerged, dark against white, motion precise where his had grown clumsy. She moved with the economy of someone born to this land, every gesture aligned with the rhythms of ice and weather. The fur of her parka was rimmed with frost, her hood drawn low, her posture balanced as though the storm itself were something she could negotiate with rather than endure. She was Inuit, unmistakably so, not in stereotype, but in bearing, in the quiet authority of someone who belongs where others trespass. Elias stopped, not because he chose to, but because his legs refused the argument. His vision narrowed, the world reduced to contrast and ache, and he wondered briefly if she was real or the last mercy of a mind starved of oxygen and hope. When she reached him, there was no panic in her eyes, only assessment. She studied the way his shoulders slumped inward, the tremor in his hands, the frost-bitten edges of his gloves. Her gaze was not unkind, but it was unsentimental. Survival here did not allow for indulgence. The storm deepened with alarming speed. Wind howled now, no longer patient, lifting snow into blinding sheets that erased distance and direction alike. The temperature dropped as if the sky had opened a door and forgotten to close it. Elias felt the first sharp edge of fear cut through his exhaustion. Not the fear of death itself, but of dying without meaning, without witness, dissolving into the white without having altered anything at all. He tried to speak, to ask her name or offer his own, but the words froze at his lips, swallowed by the gale. She reached for him, firm and decisive, pulling him toward a low rise of ice that offered minimal shelter. The movement jolted something awake in him, a reflex older than thought. As they moved, the storm shifted again, angling its force directly into her path. Elias saw it in a flash, the way the wind would hit her first, how her smaller frame would take the full violence of it. How one wrong step could mean a fall that the cold would not forgive. He did not think. Thinking was a luxury the Arctic had already taken from him. When the gust struck, he turned instinctively, placing himself between her and the wind. His back took the impact, pain blooming across his shoulders and spine as the cold bit through every layer he wore. Snow packed against him, driven hard enough to sting like thrown gravel, and he felt his knees threaten to buckle. Still, he held. He leaned into the force, arms braced, body angled to shield hers, the way he once had with someone else in another life, in another storm that had ended very differently. For the first time, she reacted not as a hunter or guardian of ice, but as a woman startled by an unexpected truth. Her breath caught, a sharp sound almost lost to the wind, and she stared at the man now absorbing the storm meant for her. This was not strategy, not calculation. This was instinct born of something deeper than survival. In her world, sacrifice was understood, but it was rarely offered so freely, especially by an outsider already so close to his limits. They held that way longer than was safe. Elias felt the cold, gnawing inward, a creeping numbness that threatened to turn pain into something far more dangerous. His thoughts drifted, images bleeding into one another. The face of a child he had failed, the sound of a door closing behind him years ago, the long road north that had seemed necessary at the time. He wondered if this was how he would be remembered, if at all, a shape in the snow, briefly useful, then gone. She moved at last, pulling him down behind the ice ridge with a strength that surprised him. The shelter was meager, but it broke the worst of the wind, creating a pocket of relative calm where breath no longer felt like glass. She pressed her forehead briefly to his shoulder, a gesture so quick it might have been imagined, and in that instant something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition. The Arctic had witnessed them both, and it does not forget such moments easily. As the storm roared on, Elias slipped closer to unconsciousness, the edges of the world softening despite the cold. He felt her hands working efficiently, adjusting his clothing, securing them together for warmth, anchoring them to the ice, as if binding him not just to survival, but to her. Somewhere in the distance, beneath the howl of wind and shifting ice, the land itself seemed to listen. He woke the way men wake after nearly dying, without the relief of safety, only the confusion of still being here. The first thing Elias felt was cold, but different now. Not the violent, predatory cold of the open storm, rather a steady, biting presence held at bay by shelter and human effort. The second thing he felt was the weight of something heavy across his chest. Fur, layered fabric, and an arm placed there with deliberate care, as if someone had decided his breathing mattered. His eyes opened slowly, lids stiff, lashes still crusted with remnants of snow that had melted and refrozen at the corners. The air smelled of smoke and dried hide and something faintly metallic that reminded him of old tools and sea salt, like the memory of fishing boats, but cleaner, sharper, as if the Arctic had filtered it through ice. A small lamp flickered somewhere, not bright enough to soften the shadows, but enough to reveal the interior of a low structure built for endurance. The walls were close, insulated with layers that looked lived in rather than staged, practical seams, repaired corners, bundles stacked with intention. This was not a place made to impress outsiders. It was a place made to keep breathing when the world outside wanted the opposite. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain spoke from his back, deep and blunt, like a bruise that reached the bone. His throat was raw, tongue thick, and when he swallowed, it felt as though he were dragging something sharp down the inside of his neck. His hands, still gloved, ached in a way that made him afraid to remove the fabric and look. He had seen frostbite before. He knew how quickly skin could become a decision you no longer controlled. He forced his breathing to stay calm, not because he was brave, but because panic would steal heat he could not afford to lose. Across from him, near the small stove, she sat perfectly still, as if the storm had never touched her at all. Her hood was down now. Dark hair, thick and straight, fell in a single braid over one shoulder, threaded with tiny flecks of ice that refused to melt. Her face held the quiet hardness of someone shaped by wind and responsibility, but the lines around her eyes carried something else too. Watchfulness that wasn't only tactical, something almost intimate in its restraint. She did not rush to explain. She did not offer comfort the way Southern people did, spilling words to fill silence. She simply looked at him as though measuring the exact amount of truth he could handle. "Water," she said, one word heavy with instruction rather than kindness. She handed him a small cup. The rim was warm, and he realized she had kept it near the stove for that purpose. The liquid inside was not plain water. It had a faint taste of something herbal, bitter at first, then strangely grounding, like swallowing a piece of earth. He drank carefully. Heat slid into him in thin lines, not enough to restore him, but enough to remind his body that returning was possible. When he lowered the cup, his hands trembled, betraying him. He hated that. He hated needing anything from anyone, because the last time he needed someone, he had learned what it meant to be left behind. He finally managed to speak. His voice came out broken, a rasp that sounded older than him. I didn't mean to. He stopped. He didn't know what he was apologizing for. For coming here? For not dying quietly? For the simple fact of being an outsider in her world? She watched him with the calm of someone who understood that words were not always the most reliable thing a man could offer. "Storm chose," she said, and this time there was a faint edge of something like meaning in her tone, the kind that carried culture with it without turning into superstition. Not magic, not a cheap omen, just the sober truth that here, weather decided when humility was necessary. Elias searched her face. "Your name?" A pause, not reluctance, consideration. Then, Scylla. The name landed in him like a stone dropped into deep water. He had heard the word before in old notes and overheard conversations, something about air, breath, weather, the presence of what moves between things. But he didn't say any of that. He didn't romanticize it. He simply nodded because her name was not for his curiosity. It was a door, and she was choosing to open it a fraction. He tried to remember the last thing he'd felt before the dark. He remembered turning, taking the wind. He remembered thinking it was too late for him anyway. That was the part that returned like a knife. He hadn't shielded her because he expected gratitude. He had done it because in that instant, he could not bear the thought of failing again. Somewhere inside him, something still believed he could be the kind of man who didn't step aside when someone smaller took the hit. Scylla rose, quiet as a shadow, and knelt beside him. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, checking his face, the edges of his ears, the bridge of his nose, places the cold loved most. She tugged his gloves down enough to inspect his fingers. Elias flinched, not from pain alone, but from the intimacy of being handled when he felt so helpless. She noticed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in understanding. "You fight even when you cannot," she said, and there was no mockery in it, only observation. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh but carried no humor. "I don't know how to stop." That was the closest he had come to honesty in years, and the hut seemed to absorb it, holding it in the smoke and quiet the way thick fur holds heat. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. Scylla turned back to the stove and stirred something in a pot. The smell rose stronger now, fat, broth, something nourishing and real. Elias's stomach tightened with hunger so sharp it bordered on shame. When she handed him a bowl, he took it with both hands, careful, almost reverent, because he understood what this meant. Not charity, but responsibility. In a land like this, you did not feed someone without deciding they were, for now, under your protection. He ate slowly. Each swallow brought warmth, not just physical but emotional, and that frightened him more than the storm had. Warmth made people reckless. Warmth made people hope, and hope, he had learned, could become a trap if you held it too tightly. When he finished, Scylla spoke again, and this time her voice carried a different weight, like a warning delivered without drama. "Tomorrow," she said, eyes steady on his. "They will come." He stared at her. "Who?" "The clan," she answered. No fear in her face, but attention, subtle and controlled, as if she already knew the shape of what was waiting outside the walls. "They saw tracks. They smelled smoke. They know an outsider is here." Elias felt the air shift inside him. His body was still weak, but his mind sharpened. "If they don't want me here—" Scylla cut him off with a single look, the kind that made words feel childish. "It is not about want," she said. "It is about why." And that question, Why, hung between them like a blade suspended in the dark. Because Elias didn't know how to explain that he had come north carrying grief like contraband, that he had been running from a mistake he couldn't undo, that he had wanted the cold to burn something out of him, something rotten, and now, instead of being erased by the storm, he had been saved by a woman who seemed carved from the same land that wanted to kill him. He lay back down, the exhaustion returning in waves, but sleep didn't feel like rest anymore. It felt like waiting. Outside, the wind had softened, but the Arctic was never truly quiet. The ice shifted somewhere far off, groaning like an old animal turning in its sleep. And beneath that sound, Elias imagined footsteps, approaching, purposeful, inevitable, closing in on the fragile shelter where he had survived the night. They arrived without ceremony. No shouting, no sudden intrusion, no dramatic break of silence. The Arctic does not announce judgment. It simply brings it to your door. Elias knew they were there before he heard anything human. The dogs sensed it first. A low, restrained sound carried through the cold air, not barking but acknowledgement, as if even the animals understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Then came the rhythm of movement outside the shelter. Measured steps, boots compressing snow with a confidence that came only from belonging, not hurried, not hesitant, the kind of approach that assumed the land itself would step aside. Inside the hut, the warmth had begun to feel temporary. Smoke curled lazily upward from the stove, tracing slow shapes along the ceiling beams, and the scent of broth lingered like a memory already fading. Elias pushed himself upright, ignoring the protest from his back and shoulders. His body was still compromised, but the numbness had retreated enough to leave pain in its place, sharp and insistent. Pain, at least, meant he was still present, still accountable. Scylla stood near the entrance now, her posture altered in a way he hadn't seen before. She was no longer simply a hunter who had dragged a man out of a storm. She was something else entirely, an axis around which the space organized itself. Her shoulders were squared, her breathing steady, her gaze focused not inward, but outward, as though she were already addressing people who were not yet visible. Elias realized then that what he had witnessed the night before was not her full strength. It had been restraint. The door covering shifted, light flooding in briefly, harsh and white, before settling into shadow again. Shapes filled the entrance, broad silhouettes wrapped in fur and tradition, faces weathered into permanence by wind and responsibility. They did not crowd the space, they did not rush him. They stood just inside the threshold, eyes moving with quiet efficiency, taking in the scene. The outsider on the bedding, the stove still warm, Scylla positioned between him and them without any overt declaration. No one spoke at first. Silence stretched, dense but not empty. Elias felt it pressing against his chest, heavier than the storm had been. He had stood before men like this before, in different uniforms, different climates, men who measured worth in action rather than explanation. He knew better than to fill the quiet with excuses. In places like this, words offered too quickly were often a liability. An older man stepped forward at last. His hair was streaked with white, not from age alone, but from a life spent in conversation with snow. His eyes were sharp, reflective, carrying the kind of depth that came from remembering things others preferred to forget. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, shaped by years of being listened to without demanding it. "He stayed," the man said, not a question. Scylla answered without turning. "He did." Another pause. The man's gaze shifted to Elias, lingering on the way he sat upright despite the pain, the way his hands remained visible, open, unthreatening. "He could have taken cover alone." "Yes," Scylla said. The word settled into the room like a stone placed deliberately on ice, testing its strength. Elias felt the urge to speak, to explain that he hadn't planned anything, That instinct had made the decision before thought had time to intervene, but he held back. Something in Sila's stillness told him this was not the moment for his voice. This was not a trial conducted in words. It was an accounting of behavior. Another figure moved, a woman this time, younger than the elder but carrying herself with equal certainty. Her eyes flicked to Elias's back, where the storm had struck hardest, then to Sila. "You were exposed," she said quietly. "I was," Sila replied. The implication hung there, unspoken but unmistakable. Exposure in the Arctic was not an inconvenience. It was a line drawn between those who continued and those who became part of the land's long memory. Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but an unfamiliar sense of being seen without distortion. They were not imagining his action as heroism. They were assessing cost. The elder nodded once, and he placed himself between. "Yes," Sila said again, her voice steady, but Elias noticed the slightest tension at the edge of it now, like ice under pressure. Without being asked. The room shifted, not dramatically, subtly, the way weather changes direction without warning. Elias felt it in the air, a recalibration happening around him. The clan members exchanged brief glances, small movements loaded with shared history. This was not unprecedented, but it was rare. The elder stepped closer. He crouched slightly to bring himself level with Elias, not out of deference, but out of intention. His gaze held Elias firmly now, weighing him not as an intruder, but as an unresolved variable. "Why?" the elder asked. The question was simple. It allowed no ornament. Elias swallowed, his throat still raw, and met the man's eyes. He could have said many things. He could have spoken of gratitude, of instinct, of the storm forcing his hand. But none of that felt true enough to stand on its own. The truth was heavier, less convenient. "Because if I moved," Elias said slowly, each word pulled from somewhere deeper than habit, "I would have lived knowing I chose myself again." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not assessment. It was recognition. Sila turned then, just enough to look at him fully, and something unreadable crossed her face. Something like confirmation, or perhaps relief. The elder studied Elias for a long moment, then straightened. He did not smile. He did not nod. But his voice, when it came, carried a new gravity. "You will remain," he said, "until you can stand without borrowing strength." Elias exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was not acceptance. It was not forgiveness. It was permission to exist a little longer in a place that demanded justification for every heartbeat. As the clan members began to move, stepping further inside, setting down tools, adjusting the space as if Elias's presence were now a fact rather than a problem, he understood something with sudden clarity. Shielding Sila from the storm had not been the moment of consequence. This was. The Arctic had not tested him with cold alone. It was testing what he would do when survival no longer depended only on his body, but on the meaning of his choice. Time did not soften around him. It tightened. And Elias learned quickly that staying alive among them required more than having survived the storm. The days that followed were not marked by ceremony or explanation. No one asked him where he came from, and no one offered reassurance that he belonged. The Arctic does not comfort. It observes. Elias was given a place to rest, tasks he could manage despite his injuries, and silence. Vast, intentional silence, within which he was expected to understand his position. He was neither prisoner nor guest. He was something unresolved, suspended between consequence and continuation. His body healed slowly, as bodies always do when warmth is rationed and pain is tolerated rather than resisted. The bruising across his back darkened before it faded, each movement a reminder of the night he had chosen to stand instead of turn away. Sila checked on him without hovering, adjusting bindings, bringing food, ensuring his recovery without making it the center of the day. There was no sentiment in her care, but there was consistency, and Elias came to understand that consistency here was a form of trust that had to be earned again each morning. He watched her when she thought no one was paying attention. The way she moved through the settlement was different now, not altered by him, but clarified. Children parted naturally when she passed. Hunters deferred without discussion. Elders listened when she spoke, not because she raised her voice, but because it never needed raising. Elias realized then that Selah was not merely a skilled hunter. She was a bearer of continuity, someone whose presence anchored others to a way of surviving that did not fracture under pressure. One afternoon, as pale light skimmed the ice rather than warming it, Elias followed her beyond the edge of the structures, careful to keep distance, aware that observation without intrusion was his safest posture. She stopped near a ridge overlooking a wide stretch of frozen water, the surface marked with faint lines where the ice flexed and remembered movement beneath. The wind was calmer, but it carried a warning in its restraint. "You look at the land like it owes you answers," she said without turning. Elias considered denying it, then decided against wasting the effort. "I think I hoped it would," he replied. She faced him then, her expression neutral but attentive. "The land does not explain itself," she said. "It responds." The word settled into him with an uncomfortable precision. He had spent much of his life demanding explanations, from people, from fate, from himself, believing that understanding alone could absolve him. Here, that logic felt thin. The Arctic did not care what you meant to do. It cared only what you did when conditions closed in. They stood together in silence, watching the horizon blur where sky and ice refused to declare themselves separate. Elias felt the urge to speak again, to tell her about the child whose face still haunted his sleep, about the choice he had made years ago that had set everything else in motion. But the words stayed where they were. He understood now that confession, here, was not currency. Action was. Later that night, the wind shifted again, not violently, but with enough intent to stir unease. Elias lay awake, listening to the structures creak softly, to the distant sounds of dogs repositioning, to the subtle changes that spoke of weather recalibrating itself. When movement passed outside his shelter, purposeful and quick, he was already sitting up, boots half on, heart steady but alert. Selah appeared in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the pale night. "Come," she said. They moved fast, not running but not lingering. The edge of the ice was unstable farther out than expected, a crack widening under pressure that would need reinforcing before morning travel. Elias worked alongside the others without instruction, mimicking motions, carrying weight, placing his body where it was needed rather than where it was safest. No one praised him. No one corrected him unless correction was necessary. The work absorbed him completely, leaving no room for memory or regret, only the immediacy of shared effort. At one point, the ice groaned deeply beneath them, a sound that vibrated through Elias's bones. Instinct flared. He reached out, steadying Selah as the surface shifted. She did not pull away. She did not comment. But later, when the task was done and they stood catching their breath in the cold, she looked at him differently, not as a variable, not as a burden, but as someone whose presence no longer disrupted the balance. That night, as he lay down exhausted, Elias understood something essential. Shielding Selah from the storm had been an interruption of fate. Staying, working, choosing restraint and usefulness over explanation, this was something else. This was integration, slow and conditional, and he sensed, with a mix of dread and acceptance, that the Arctic was not finished asking things of him yet. Somewhere beyond the structures, ice shifted again, deeper this time, echoing across the frozen expanse. It sounded less like warning now and more like anticipation. The morning arrived without color. Not white, not blue, only a pale absence where light should have been. Elias understood then that this day would not ask his permission. He stepped outside slowly, the cold immediately asserting itself against his lungs. his skin, the thin margin of comfort his body had begun to reclaim. The settlement was already awake. Smoke rose in narrow, disciplined columns, and figures moved with purpose between structures, their silhouettes steady, unhurried. Nothing about their behavior suggested alarm. And yet, Elias felt it. An unmistakable density in the air, the kind that gathers when something unspoken is about to be acknowledged. They formed the circle without instruction. Men and women, elders and younger hunters, arranged themselves around him at a respectful distance, boots planted firmly, bodies aligned with the wind rather than resisting it. No one blocked his exit. No one restrained him. The absence of force was deliberate. Elias felt his pulse steady as he stood at the center, aware of every eye, every breath, every shift of weight around him. This was not confrontation. It was recognition. Scylla stepped forward last. She did not take the center with him. She positioned herself just outside the circle, visible to all, her presence neither shielding nor abandoning him. Elias realized the meaning immediately. Whatever was about to happen was his to carry alone. Whatever followed would belong to them all. The elder spoke again, his voice carrying easily across the stillness. "The storm tested you," he said. "You did not step aside." He let the words rest before continuing. "Staying tested you more." Elias felt the truth of it settle into his bones. It would have been easier to leave once he could stand, easier to accept survival as a transaction completed. But staying had demanded something quieter and far more costly: consistency, humility, the willingness to be useful without being centered. "You worked without being seen," the elder continued. "You listened without asking to be taught. You placed yourself where the land required, not where pride would put you." The circle tightened, not physically, but in attention. Elias felt the weight of it, not crushing, but clarifying. He thought of the child he had lost, the moment he had chosen distance instead of presence, the years he had spent mistaking escape for endurance. Here, there was no escape, only standing. The elder turned his gaze to Scylla. "And you," he said, "did not claim him." Scylla met his eyes without hesitation. "He is not something to be claimed," she replied. "He is something to decide." A murmur moved through the circle, not disagreement, but understanding. Elias felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to relief. No one here would rewrite his past. No one would absolve him. But they would allow him to continue if he accepted the terms. The elder faced Elias once more. "You may remain," he said, "not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who has chosen to be accountable to this place." The words did not feel like reward. They felt like responsibility given shape. Elias bowed his head. Not deeply, not theatrically, but enough to acknowledge what had been offered and what would now be expected of him. When he looked up again, the circle had already begun to dissolve. People returning to their tasks, the moment absorbed into daily life the way the Arctic absorbs everything. No applause, no lingering ceremony. Survival continued. Scylla approached him then, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating through her layers. "The storm showed them who you are under pressure," she said quietly. "Time will show them who you are when there is no storm." He nodded. "That's the harder part." "Yes," she agreed, and for the first time there was something like approval in her eyes. Not pride, not affection. Trust, beginning its slow work. As the day unfolded, Elias moved among them with a new awareness, not of belonging, but of alignment. He was not healed, he was not redeemed, but he was present. And in a land that remembered every step taken upon it, presence mattered more than promises. Far out across the ice, something shifted again, deep, resonant, alive. Elias did not flinch. He listened.